afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Neele Juris, the Director of Communications and Engagement at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, also known as MORPC. And I'm also a member of the Columbus Metropolitan Club's Board of Trustees. It's my pleasure to welcome our in-person audience today and to say hello to all of you watching via our live stream. Thank you to today's forum sponsors, Cardinal Health, and with the support of the Columbus Dispatch. Today's CMC live streaming is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. Thank you to you all. So, what began as an interpretive framework for scholars has exploded on the national education scene as the newest front in America's ongoing culture war. Critical race theory, which sought to better understand the role of race in the creation of legal, economic, and social systems, is to some a way to spotlight the inequities in our society, while to others its application threatens to further divide Americans from each other. But what is critical race theory? Who is using it? How and to what end? Should critical race theory play a role in the classroom curricula? Today, our expert panel will discuss the past, present, and future of critical race theory in America. I'll introduce the panelists by name and position, and you can find out more about who they are from your forum flyer and online. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Adair, President of the Columbus Board of Education, Aaron Baer, President for Center for Christian Virtue, Kevin McGruder, Associate Professor of History at Antioch College, and our host, Alissa Widman Neese, Columbus Dispatch's K12 education reporter. But go ahead. But before we turn the program over to Alissa, Kevin McGruder will provide us with a brief overview of the history of critical race theory and why it has become the center of controversy in recent months. Kevin, the podium is all yours.
I appreciate this invitation to participate in this discussion of critical race theory. Critical race theory is a framework developed in the 1970s and 1980s by legal scholars such as Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and others in response to what they saw as a loss of momentum of the civil rights victories of the 1960s. In considering the reasons for this retrenchment, they concluded that while many view the law as a neutral institution, in U.S. history, the law has been a primary vehicle for maintaining the racial hierarchy of our society, with people of color at the bottom and white people at the top, a hierarchy that the civil rights movement sought to overcome. Critical race theorists concluded that eradication of racism in our society required a recognition of this institutional history and the influence of this legacy on contemporary laws and policies. With this recognition, a plan to dismantle the barriers to equity that such practices represent could be developed. An example of critical race theory perspective comes from my own primary area of research, the history of race and real estate. To understand the intractability of residential segregation in the United States, we have to acknowledge the role of the law that enforced racially restrictive deed covenants until the Supreme Court's 1947 Shelley versus Kramer ruling outlawed such enforcement. But this decision did not undo the residential segregation that the covenants inspired. Segregated neighborhoods continue to exist in many parts of the country today. More intentional contemporary action is required. Critical race theory is not a diversity or anti-racism training, although some of its perspectives may be incorporated into these trainings. Its purpose is not to make white people feel guilty or ashamed. Its purpose is to provide an analysis that can inspire the dismantling of laws and other practices that promote racism. Critical race theory is not taught in K-12 schools and is not often mentioned in undergraduate college classes. It is a framework that is more commonly encountered at the graduate school level. The reason there is a need today to explain what critical race theory is not is because for over a year, it has been used as a tool in an extremely successful disinformation campaign launched in 2020 by conservative activist Christopher Rufo to silence advocates of anti-racism. A June 18, 2021 New Yorker magazine article noted that in 2020, Rufo received information about what seemed to have been poorly designed anti-racism trainings that targeted white participants. Rufo concluded in articles that he wrote in City Journal, an online magazine of the Manhattan Institute, that framing these trainings and almost every other action associated with anti-racism as critical race theory in action would be an excellent way to end the trainings and to mobilize support to challenge anti-racism advocacy, which was gaining momentum. Donald Trump's September 2020 executive order outlawing critical race theory's use in federally funded trainings soon followed. In December of 2020, the American Legal Exchange Council, ALEC, held a training, which can be viewed on YouTube, for state legislators to learn how to draft anti-critical race theory legislation, with a particular focus on public education at the K-12 and college level. In Ohio, two bills, HB 322 and HB 327, are the result of this campaign. The 2014 homicide of black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, led to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and to the growth of discussions of the concept of anti-racism. Anti-racism is a framework that intersects with critical race theory, but is broader. It concludes that in an environment in which racism is perpetuated by laws, policies, and institutional practices, individually, not being racism is not enough to end racism. Instead, action is required to identify and dismantle policies and institutional practices that maintain a racial hierarchy. The disinformation campaign, fueled by Christopher Rufo, is part of a historical tradition in the United States of backlashes to the possibility of achieving racial equity. As a nation, on paper, we are a multiracial democracy, but in practice, we are a nation in which some white citizens expect to always have a dominant voice, and where the possibility of sharing power with citizens of color is seen as a threat or a loss of their power and privilege. A brief historical review. In the 1820s, when most states rewrote their constitutions to eliminate property qualifications for voting, all white men gained the vote. But many of those same states introduced, for the first time, voting restrictions for black men. In the 1870s, during the Reconstruction period that followed the Civil War, black men gained the vote, and the result was the election of 2 black men to the U.S. Senate, 16 to the House of Representatives, and hundreds to state and local offices. This fueled a backlash of racial violence that ended black voting in the South and ushered in 80 years of racial segregation and violence. The civil rights victories of the 1950s and 60s were followed by the migration of many white Southern Democrats to the Republican Party, which in the 1968 presidential campaign, Richard Nixon branded as the party of law and order. Barack Obama's 2008 election was followed by a rise in white nationalism and the environment that leads us to today's topic. When we view the current debate over critical race theory in this context, we can better understand that the debate isn't about critical race theory, but instead about a much larger issue, an age-old fear of sharing power and privilege. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that introduction. It was really informative and helpful. And I think really that's the goal for the panel today. I understand that critical race theory was a topic that many club members expressed interest in discussing. And while it might be a hotly debated topic right now, I think we can all model how to have a really informative, helpful, and respectful conversation, and hopefully learn a little bit more about each other's opinions and perspectives. So I'd like to start with a question for our other two panelists, Jennifer and Aaron. When did critical race theory surface as a topic that was being discussed among your organizations and your stakeholders? And what were you hearing from them?
Thank you for that question, Alissa. As the school board, we, obviously we are watching what's happening closely in the legislature. And so, we were watching on a national stage what was going on in just the conversation and what was happening in other states where these bills that the professor was talking about were introduced, especially around that K12 space. And so, we saw after our legislature introduced those two bills is when, as an organization, we started to really watch it and speak on it. And our board actually, issued a resolution against those two bills. So that's when it became part of our kind of monitoring. Now, what's been going on across the county, across the state, in other districts, is you've all seen it in the media. Some of you may have experienced it yourselves, where people are coming to school boards and saying, don't teach critical race theory to our kids, and it's becoming a topic that is now in the forefront of what's going on at the local level in school board governance. In our district, we don't have that right now, but we have taken a very strong stance against those two bills, as well as issued basically an anti-racism resolution at the beginning of the pandemic after the George Floyd issue. So we take these issues very seriously. Equity is one of our driving principles, really rooting out the inequities that are going on in our district to provide fair opportunity. So critical race theory in that context has come up more at a governance level, watching it as the leaders of the organization, monitoring how it's going to impact our students and classrooms.
Yeah, I'd say for us, we saw, CRT to Kevin's introduction was something I had heard about in college years ago, very briefly, didn't remember much about it, but then the issue itself started rising up in a number of, probably three different areas right after the George Floyd murder. And it was something that was popping up. I think the first place we saw it come up was in churches. So as churches were trying to talk about racism and the issues of race in our country today, one pastor told me he found himself sort of caught between these two ideologies. There was the one side that was saying, any talk of race is wokeness, and you can't, if you're mentioning issues of racism or these types of things today, then you've gone so far left and you've gone woke. And then the other side, which is saying if you're not teaching, if you're teaching CRT, you've gone Marxist. And so pastors sort of feeling caught between these, hey, look, we want to talk about race. We don't affirm the principles of CRT, but they sort of felt trapped in that spot. So that was something that we started seeing come up more and more after George Floyd. The other place we saw this was in education, where parents saw their children really being pressured to affirm tenets, especially of the organization Black Lives Matter, and affirm that the movement there that they disagreed with, and doing things like walkouts and sort of going through some shaming things around your race or around how you identify. And so we started seeing more and more parents starting to say, hey, this is happening in our schools across the state, and what do we do about that? And then the third which is very similar to what we saw happening in the schools, is sort of that same ideology that, again, we've called CRT, and I think there's Kevin raises an interesting point of, is it CRT? And I would argue generally yes, or it's influenced by CRT. We started seeing that same thing happening in corporate America, where employees were being forced to kind of go through what they would say is what I would say is a shaming exercise around sort of things that they had nothing to do with. And so that's where and again, it really was, from our perspective, the whole debate really popped up and started raging within the last 18 months to a year.
Thank you for that. And Kevin, I wanted to turn it back to you now. We've had several professors and school leaders go on the record in the dispatch, and you as well in your introduction, saying that critical race theory as an academic concept isn't something that's typically taught at the K-12 level. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Like, were you surprised to hear about these conversations bubbling up as it relates to K-12 education, and is what's happening critical race theory?
No. What's happening is not critical race theory. What's happening is people who are skilled in communication are using a technique known as the straw man. When you don't have a good argument for your opponent, you frame your opponent's argument as something ridiculous, and then you develop an argument around that ridiculous opposition that you've created. I've been teaching at the college level for about 20 years. I have not taught critical race theory. What I teach is, in understanding history, if you don't understand the role that slavery and racism has played in our country, and you graduate from college, you're going to be uninformed. And I'm not going to teach people who 10 years after they leave my class are uninformed. And that's what this is about. And part of the reasons why it's being structured that way is because they don't want to say they're against anti-racism. Because if they're against anti-racism, what does that make them? And so what they've done is manipulated what critical race theory is to serve their purposes. And I think if we kind of spend a lot of time drilling down on what critical race is, it's a process, a system of evaluating the law. It's relatively narrow. And so nobody is teaching third graders that. You're not even teaching college freshmen that. And it's almost kind of like a charade that we're all kind of trapped in, I believe. Yeah.
Aaron or Jennifer, do you have anything you'd like to say in response to that?
Yeah, and I would just disagree with, I'm sorry, Jennifer, if you had.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I would just disagree with that on a few different levels. One, first and foremost, on the claim of straw man, I feel like a lot of times there's a straw man built up against those who oppose CRT, and that's that, this idea that those that oppose CRT don't want our nation's history taught, don't want the history of racism, the Trail of Tears, I'm Jewish ethnically, and the history of anti-Semitism and all that. We want to just get all that history out. We want to blot it over and just say America was the greatest nation and nothing ever bad happened here. That couldn't be farther from the truth. And a lot of times when I ended up talking about this, that's the claim I'm having to respond to. No, we want that history taught. We want that perspective taught. And I want to go back to something that Kevin mentioned in his introduction, where he said, this is. It talks about how CRT leads to the inspiring of the dismantling of laws and policies. And I think when you read some of the folks that are writing the most around CRT today, Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, they'll talk about how CRT is a perspective on how knowledge, language, and power are all sort of corrupted by this history of racism. And so it has this sort of conspiratorial mindset of everything that we interact with in society today is racist, and there's no getting around it, and it becomes almost this unfalsifiable argument, and everything gets sort of funneled through this lens of race. And when you start there, that's where you see, absolutely I agree, that you're not seeing people, hey, boys and girls, today let's talk about critical race theory. That's not happening. I don't think anybody's arguing that's happening. But what you are seeing is you're seeing the world interpreted, everything from history to language to mathematics, interpreted through a critical race theory lens, saying this is the true and accurate framework to understand the world. And if that's the true and accurate framework to understand the world, everything that we study needs to be perceived through this lens.
So we have some people saying that critical race theory isn't being taught in schools. We have some people saying that it is to a sense, being used to frame some of the discussions happening in schools. Regardless of what we're calling it, there are some changes happening in schools right now. And Jennifer, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what's happening at Columbus City Schools as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and things that maybe might be mislabeled as critical race theory.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alissa. I think that in the K-12 space, we are totally misusing this label, critical race theory. Critical race theory, as has been explained to us, is a very narrow construct and something that is used to really evaluate legal end systems. What's happening in the K-12 space is a intentional shift to really focus on teaching culturally responsive methods and techniques, really valuing and appreciating every student and their background as they come through the door, and our staff's backgrounds as they come through the door, and ensuring that as we're teaching the standards that have been set out for us, that our curriculum really supports individual learning, growth, and development of each child. It's really important that children can connect to the lessons that they are learning, that they can see themselves in the stories that are told to them, that they can appreciate the differences that come with their neighbors and their friends and their families, because that's really what makes us stronger. It's important that our students can understand that feelings are okay, and empathy is the key to how we are going to move forward as a society. This is what is being done in the K-12 space. We are ensuring that this is being done with professionals who are trained in a psychologically safe manner for all that are involved. What we're doing is talking about things at the appropriate level for each child in each grade band that touch on the standards that we are required to teach in the state of Ohio, by infusing content and stories that help our children learn better. That's what we are doing. Now, are some classes maybe higher up in high school with some electives, maybe touching on themes of racism or how race comes into play? Yeah, because this is part of our history, right, Aaron? Part of our history. We cannot shy away from this. This is how we are, who we are, how we were created, and it's important each student is able to articulate these things as they leave our doors in the public education space. We are not at all teaching CRT, and I just have to keep saying that because that is not the case. What we are doing is teaching and shifting our methods to really focus on each child and giving them the things they need in order to succeed, and really focusing on this idea of cultural responsiveness. Thanks, Alissa.
Yeah, thanks for that. So this is a question for whoever wants to take a stab at it first, but should we be having these conversations about racism and its role in history with students? And if so, what is the right way to do that? How do you guide that kind of conversation and make sure it is age appropriate and make sure that students aren't leaving that space with negative feelings, for example?
The approach with good teaching is a cooperative exercise that I think some of the people who are behind these laws don't understand that. And so when they're talking about teachers creating divisive situations, if you have shamed your students, you've lost them. And so a good teacher is not doing that. And so when we are talking about race, the purpose is for a black or white child or Latino, Asian child growing up today, seeing racial disparities that exist today. Often the explanation is because some people work harder than others. And if they don't understand the history behind that, they believe that. And some people do work harder than others, but it's not by race. But we have racial disparities, and the reason for that is the history of our country. And so that's what we're trying to describe. And no student should feel shamed by that. And that's not the intent of good teachers. I'm not saying it never happens, but like I said, if you shame the student, you've lost them. And so that's the approach. These aren't obscure facts. They're readily available about the history of race in the country. And there are schools where children do not learn that, and they enter the world uninformed. I do have students in my classes say, why didn't I hear about this before? And I'm not teaching them any diabolical conspiracy or anything like that. I'm teaching them what well-informed students should know. And that's my goal as a teacher.
Yeah, no, the only thing I would add to that, he used the phrase cooperative exercise, and I think a lot of what you're seeing today in that cooperative exercise that especially when you're seeing in the education space and what you're seeing at a lot of school boards, is parents feeling left out of this equation. Parents feeling like they're not being fully brought into the conversation of what's happening, and they're being, again, and this is the downstream effect of the framework of CRT being implemented in the classroom, of children feeling like, or parents feeling like their children are being taught something through a lens that is harmful, that is racist in some aspects. I think about, again, this conversation's happening both in the church along with the in education. There's a theologian, a guy named King's College professor named Anthony Bradley, someone I respect greatly. He actually is someone that's not opposed to critical race theory, and he wrote an essay that he said, with CRT, the church should be able to eat the meat and spit out the bones. That was his argument, that hey, there's some things in CRT that are helpful to the church to understanding the context of race in America, and there's some things that aren't, and we should just toss those things aside. And I appreciated that framework of it. However, what I disagreed with him on that is that the meat of CRT, the benefits of CRT, talking about the history of racism, talking about how that history, again, you don't have in one generation ago, you had, a lot of the grandparents here, or our grandparents here, were individuals that lived segregation. You don't abolish the effects of that in only a few decades. But the meat of CRT that we're able to get, we can get other places without everything else that comes along with it, with these power dynamics and seeing it in all things, and sort of group and broad guilt and shame that come along with CRT.
Can I jump in here? I think that there's some kind of misunderstanding or misconception about K12 curriculum in general, that somehow it's been labeled perfect already. And the truth is it's not. The truth is it is far from perfect. The truth is K12 curriculum is taught differently in every state. You can pick up a textbook that is made by the same company that has different facts, different stories told, depending on where you are. The Texas book is different than the Ohio book. I think there's a misconception. The winners write the history. The winners write the story. And I think this is a move to center it, to really highlight in those stories and context other stories, other people's stories in that shared history. It isn't just the Pilgrims came over and the Indians were bad and they took over the Indian. I mean, that can't be the shared story. It can't be the shared story that we only learn about Black history during February and we go from slavery to the civil rights movement. That cannot be the shared story because that is not our history. That is a story. It isn't a statement of fact. History are facts. And that's what we're trying to pull into when we talk about cultural responsiveness. And I wonder why. Why is it that it is so bad to talk about? And another thing about feelings, I mentioned that earlier. Feelings are okay. We need to have feelings because all humans do. And the beautiful part of the K-12 space is that we help our children understand how to interpret their own feelings, have it come out in a safe way that is productive. right? We're so into that right now. Hello, social emotional learning, if anyone has heard about that. That's what that all is about. So why not be able to have these kind of conversations, have these spaces that are safe in a manner that is appropriate for the child at each grade level and, works in that setting. And when I talk about appropriateness for the child, I need you to understand, kindergartners are not learning about racism. Kindergartners are learning about themselves and their role in community. They're learning about their identities. They're learning about the people in their lives and their neighborhoods. They're learning how to read a map and draw their neighborhood, right? Think about what you are, but in that context, in your neighborhood, in your society, you're already getting filters in. And then it builds as the child gets older and older. Those are the standards that the Ohio Department of Education has set forth, that every public school district in Ohio is doing. And so these things are incremental, and these things are done in a way that builds children and should build them in a way to produce graduates that can go on to college and sit in a professor's class and understand history, and also be mentally and socially ready to have those conversations.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I just really appreciate the honest, passionate, open discussion. This has been really wonderful. We're going to move to questions from our in-person and live stream audience in just a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you one final question before we do that. I think we've had a really good discussion about the past and the present, but I want to look to the future, and might seem like a pretty broad question, but where do we go from here? What are the goals that you have for the education of students of all ages as it relates to this topic? And what are you thinking we're going to see in the upcoming school year when students return this month?
I'll start. In our school, we are going to see no change. Our teachers are going to do the thing they are paid to do, the thing that they're doing very well, following all of the principles and standards, creating all that I said, those psychologically safe spaces, working on building culturally competent curriculum. I think, though, in the education space in Ohio, we're in for a fight. And you have a school board here in your capital city that is willing to fight. And so that's what your elected officials will do. We're going to leave the politics out of the classroom, let our teachers do their job, and the politicians are going to handle it from here.
For me, Antioch College is a private college, so we aren't directly affected by the laws that are dealing with public education. I'm going to continue teaching the way I've been teaching. Personally, I am very concerned, and the analogy that comes to mind for me is Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 to 1693, when for 9 months, over a dozen people were put to death as witches. And when you look at what allowed that to happen, it was a combination of manipulation of the law, justified by religious belief, that allowed that to happen. It ended when the governor who had been out of the state came back, and everybody was like, the scales fell off, and what have we done? And I feel like we're in that moment, not just because of critical race theory, but who would have thought that we have a nation where facts don't matter? And we've been in that for half a decade. And how do we get out of it? So the fact is that critical race theory is something, but it's not what these people are saying it is. But we cannot get out of this loop we're in. And it's almost like we need the governor, some governor, to come back and set things right so we can see reality. And I'm 63 years old, so I'm not so optimistic that that's going to happen in the direction that we're going. And so I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think a few things of where we go from here. I think one, and I can't thank CMC enough for this, this kind of discussion doesn't happen a lot, where people with very different views come together and very different perspectives. I will say, I think, the people that disagree with CRT, people that I work with, folks that support us, the people we work with, we talk about this all the time of how do we humanize the people we disagree with, and I think for anything real, anything progressive to happen on this issue where we're actually coming to some resolution, it's not going to happen in the current political climate we are in, where we all just kind of go to our tribes and sit there and live in it. The people that oppose CRT are not racist. They don't want. It's not that they don't want, the history of race and the serious, ugly history of our country taught. That's not true. They have concerns about how it's being implemented, and I think the more we can understand each other, the better it'll be. I think one of the things that we're going to see from this in the future, and this is something that my organization is advocating for, and it's something that Jennifer and I would disagree on, again, very seriously, is more school choice. We're big advocates of what's called the backpack bill, to give every child the option to access a scholarship to attend the public school of their choice. And I think you're seeing a lot of this debate and a lot of other things in our world right now driving that move towards more educational opportunities for children and families. And I think you're going to see more of these CRT laws, anti-CRT laws being considered. That's going to be debated this fall here in Ohio. And so, there's going to be a lot of things. This debate is far from over. We can have this discussion 2 or 3, 10 years from now. And hopefully we'll make some progress in the discussion.
Thank you, everyone. So it is CMC's tradition to take audience questions, and Jane Scott of CMC is curating questions from the live stream audience and from our in-house audience. Please keep your questions brief and to the point. Jane, what's our first question?
Well, I have some questions that were asked from people who registered, as well as I'm getting questions from people online. I'll do one, and then every other one. So we'll have an opportunity for both. And we probably won't get to all the questions, so we appreciate that. This is from Carmen Casillas, Columbus Metropolitan Library. For those who are immediately opposed to a critical viewing of the past, how do you propose we bridge the gap? How can we invite those who see criticism as a thoughtful engagement with a difficult subject, but not as thoughtful engagement with a difficult subject, but as inherently anti-American as a process?
I don't know. I don't. And that's what I mean about when a starting point is usually facts. But when, like COVID, there are facts, but we're living in the Delta variant. Voting, election results are facts, but they're being manipulated. And so when you're in that environment, this is something we have not experienced as a nation before, so I don't know.
I'd say the starting point is charity, is looking at somebody who disagrees with you and not ascribing terrible motives to them, and recognizing that they too want the best for society. They're not looking to oppress any individual or any class, and they just come to their conclusions, their endeavors to do this a different way. This is something we do a lot in the interfaith dialogue with Muslims or Jews or atheists or anybody else of starting off of, we both want to see people flourish, and the way your perspective on how we do this is this religious belief is through Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And so, I think starting off in that charitable mindset when having a discussion with someone is the way, if this conversation is able to move forward, is the way it gets done.
My name is Becky White. I have read several articles in the Wall Street Journal over the last year and a half that indicate that there's reason to be concerned about CRT being included in the curriculum. The NEA promoted it. The Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education promoted it. California passed legislation to include it in the school systems there, K through 12. So in light of that, And given the concerns that sometimes there might be overreach in training in CRT where there's shaming going on or fingers being pointed at people who can't really do anything about it, why wouldn't the Ohio Board of Education support the Ohio bills to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the classroom?
That kind of thing is not happening in the classroom. CRT is not part of the curriculum. It is not being taught. It is not a standard. That is not what is going on here in Ohio. Now, are there conversations? Does race come up in the context of history? Yes, it does, because it is part of our history. I can't speak to what the State Board of Education does. I would strongly suggest they oppose these bills and fight for the education, a factual education that all of our students should have. But it is not happening. It's not happening in Ohio.
To chime in real quick, in Ohio, there is no standardized state curriculum. Districts are left to decide how they teach specific state standards. So the idea of CRT being mandated at the state level would not happen.
This question is from Michael Deacons from Capitol High School. What does the term white supremacy culture mean, and how does it relate to critical race theory?
Me. Okay. If we were in Ohio in 1921, we might hear white supremacy being used pretty regularly because they were not ashamed of it. The Klan rose to power after Birth of a Nation in 1915. Indiana became their base. That's what's that's the most extreme example of white supremacy. But what white supremacy is a belief that if white people aren't on the top in every situation, something is wrong, and efforts need to be made to make it right. And if we look at what's happened in the last few years, there are people who believe that, and we know it. And they've done things, but we're pretending like it doesn't exist and it's something new, and it's not.
I think the one thing I would just add to that really briefly is white supremacy does exist, and there's absolutely people that still are advocating and pushing for that. I think we might have a disagreement on the proportionality of it, and I think one of the things that, again, from a charitable mindset, the idea that sometimes what's purported by some folks is that every person that voted for Donald Trump is a white supremacist, and a white supremacist as defined by Kevin. No, I'm not saying you're saying that by all means, Kevin. I'm not ascribing that to you at all.
But when you bring that into a conversation following up with me, that's what you're implying. No, and I did not do that.
No, and by all means, Kevin, I am not ascribing that to you in the least.
Why talk about it at all?
Because a lot of the folks that are the Robin DiAngelos of the world, the Ibram X. Kendis of the world, a lot of the major voices in culture today advocating for CRT, the very discussion that we're having today, would suppose something like that. And when you turn on MSNBC, you turn on CNN, you hear that pushed. When you turn on Fox, you hear the other narrative pushed that everybody that is pushing CRT hates America and wants to destroy it. It's all made to divide us and to have us go at each other's throats. I 100% agree with what you just described there, Kevin. I'm not ascribing this to you in the least. But what I'm saying, in the cultural narrative we're having, the cultural conversation that's going on even outside of this room, all too often, those are the things. It's the same thing I see oftentimes in the church where people will think anybody that voted for Joe Biden wants to kill all babies because he's not pro-life. And that's not true. And we need to be able to not let ourselves get divided by over-the-top rhetoric. And that's the point I'm trying to make there.
My name is Dara Pizzuti, and I just want to say thank you to all of you. This is a tough subject. My question is for Aaron. There's been quite a bit in the news lately with some of the schools, particularly some of the private schools here, who are wrestling with this challenge. And it's interesting because, I'll be honest, I have friends, dear friends, that I love and adore and respect on both sides of this issue. And I thought you made a very good point when you said we have to start by listening to one another. And I try very hard to listen to both sides. I find it interesting, though, that when I talk to my friends and peers who support your point of view more and want to keep CRT out of the schools, and I find myself saying to them, what is it about CRT that you find so offensive? And you know, what is the real problem here in your school? Because to me, I'm in those schools and they're not teaching it. They don't often have the answer. They fall back on the rhetoric. And so I guess I'm asking you point blank, what is it that people find, that your constituents find so offensive about CRT that they're so afraid of?
Yeah, you know, at its core, and again, this is where we have to have the conversation, and a lot of times CRT is used as a broad term, as Kevin alluded to earlier, that, you know, wraps in anti-racism, wraps in intersectionality, a lot of these other concepts, and it's all, a lot of times it in a very inarticulate way, gets all bunched under CRT. And folks will say, well, we're talking about CRT, the theory, not CRT, the application of it. And so what most folks are having a problem with is what's being applied in schools through the mindset of, you know, inspired by the mindset of CRT. Again, the way I would describe CRT is it's, you know, the theory of how language, power, and knowledge have all been corrupted and geared towards sort of a racist end. And so what they have a problem with, most people, what they have a problem with is that the teaching that gets taught about race, the teaching that gets taught about American history, and the way racism is taught is that I can know something about someone. I can know something about an individual and their character based on their race alone. And so if that's the mindset that people are, that is being taught, that I can know something about who you are, I can know something about your character based on your race, and that's where you get this whole thing of like, hey, introduce yourself and say, you know, you saw this happening in some corporations, you saw this happening with walkouts in school, that you need to apologize for your race, and by apologizing, you are inferring that you have done something racist, you have done something of ill intent to people, and that would be again the major concern that most parents and folks have about the way the implementation of this framework is being used in the schools today.
There's no direct link between what you're describing and critical race theory. You're describing our ham-handed trainings. The same cooperation is required in a training as in any kind of classroom. So if you're doing a training and you've made the people you're training feel uncomfortable, you have not been successful. And most diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings do not do that. But what Christopher Rufo did is cherry pick probably the worst of best practices and suggest that that represents a whole field, and it's not a CRT field, it's a field probably of diversity and anti-racism training. But that's something separate, but CRT is getting blamed for that.
State your name.
Okay, my name is Daphne Mooring, and my question is for Aaron. I've 58 years raised as a Christian, continue to learn to be a better Christian every day, and the thing that keeps troubling me with this Christian organization creating the divisiveness is I was first taught to love my neighbor as myself. It didn't matter the color of their skin. When Jesus died, he died to redeem all of our souls, right? Not a particular color skin. So will you reconcile how the whole Christian fundamentals meets what you're advocating?
And I appreciate that in so many ways, because it's what I love talking the most about, which is God's word and its redemptive effect on us. And God's word, when we read God's word in its entirety in the Bible, we see this Lord Jesus Christ who came down and told us, greatest commandment is to love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the question is, what does that mean? And thankfully we have 66 books of the Bible and the letters from the epistles to understand that. And I think one thing in particular that I really come back to on this is the idea of, in Christianity, we teach this idea of crucifying yourself. I died myself and I've been risen again in Jesus Christ. And that means all of our all of our intuitions, everything that we are about ourselves, we lay down and we take on this life of Jesus. We take on this Holy Spirit, and it changes the way we look at the world. And that will mean sometimes loving our neighbor means disagreeing with them if we see them doing something or supporting something that, according to God's word, is harmful to their eternal soul. And that also means, as the same Jesus who told us to love our neighbor as ourselves tells us that, when we do, he lived perfect, we believe he lived the perfect life and was perfect love, and they crucified him for it. So, oftentimes having people disagree with you, we're told that will come, and the book of James tells us that. And so, it's a tough road, and we talk about a lot at CCV. We want to do this advocacy when we take on difficult issues with the utmost grace and love and charity towards those who disagree with us. But we also want to do so firmly, and that's what we attempt to do. Understanding that even people, again, Kevin attends a church, and he would disagree strongly with a lot of the positions that we believe the Bible has led us to.
I lead the trustee board at Central Chapel African American Episcopal Church. The reason why there is an African Methodist Episcopal Church is in the 1700s, as black people began going to white churches, Christians overlaid their racism on top of that. Richard Allen was pulled off his knees at a church in Philadelphia, and he left and said, "We will bother you no more." Columbus is the headquarters of the 3rd District of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That district covers Pennsylvania, Ohio, parts of West Virginia. It was formed in 1833. The denomination was formed in 1816. We have a black church because the white church did not treat us as equals and as neighbors. And so we need to understand that history.
My name is Kwesi Cambone, and I think it's really great that we're having this discussion, but the danger for me is we have to be careful we don't deal in generalities. And Aaron, my question is for you, because you talked about the concern about how critical race theory has been implemented, but I want to know from you specifics. That is, talk to us about a district, a school, or somebody. Just give specifics about how it has been implemented. What have you seen? What do you know? Because I think the danger is without specifics, we don't add any light to this conversation.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that question. I think there's a few different ones I can give stories, and a lot of these things you can find online as well. You have the extreme examples in places like San Francisco where they have stopped teaching algebra because they have said mathematics perpetuates a systematic of racism. You have things here in Columbus at one prominent non-public school, actually, where teachers and a handful of students led a walkout of students to protest as a part of a Black Lives Matter movement and supporting, opposing systematic racism. And again, for students who might agree that racism is a problem, but don't agree with the mantras and everything else that goes along with that movement, they're feeling pressured and shamed to go along with that. And that you can go through, we can see examples like that happening all over the country, especially over the last year. Bishop Hartley.
Well, I wish we had more time, but we're going to turn it back over to Niall now for concluding remarks.
Okay. Well, I hope you found today's forum insightful and helpful as you continue to have these important conversations in your community. Please make plans to join us next Wednesday as CMC presents Unpacking Ohio's New Biennial Budget. Our thanks to forum sponsors Cardinal Health, the Columbus Dispatch, and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch and PNC. And thank you to our online virtual seat patrons. And our special appreciation and thanks to our speakers, Jennifer Adair, Aaron Baer, Kevin McGruder, and our host, Alissa Widman Neese. Thank you all for joining us. We could not do this without you. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at the Columbus Metropolitan Club as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Thank you.